This is James. My wife's father introduced the man at Christmas dinner. He'll be perfect for your position at the company after you get laid off and divorce. I buttered my roll calmly. How nice. James, did they mention the company is in my name? And the prenup? My wife choked on her wine. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and immediately sense you're about to get royally screwed? Yeah. Well, Christmas dinner at the Peaton Mansion was giving me those vibes in spades. The whole joint was decked out like Martha Stewart had a nervous breakdown in a Hallmark store. Gold everything. Enough mistletoe to choke a reindeer and a Christmas tree so massive it probably required its own zip code. But all that festive cheer couldn't mask the stench of wafting through the air like cheap cologne at a gas station. I should have known something was up when Gloria actually smiled at me on the drive over. My dear wife hadn't looked at me with anything other than contempt since. Well, hell, I couldn't remember the last time. She'd been acting all sweet and giggly, like she was harboring some delicious secret that she couldn't wait to spill all over the white tablecloth. Red flag number 1 right there. When your spouse starts treating you nice after months of acting like you're a walking case of athlete's foot, you better start watching your back. The dining room was its usual intimidating self. Mahogany table that could probably seat half of Nebraska, crystal chandelier that cost more than most people's houses, and enough silverware to arm a small militia. Richard Pemberton sat at the head of the table like some medieval king holding court, his silver hair perfectly styled and his smile sharp enough to cut glass. The man looked like he'd stepped out of a Ralph Lauren catalog if Ralph Lauren specialized in designing clothes for pompous jackasses. Miranda, Gloria's sister and professional hot mess, was already 3 glasses deep in what I assumed was her liquid dinner. The woman had perfected the art of passive-aggressive alcoholism, managing to insult you while maintaining just enough plausible deniability to claim innocence. Later, she gave me that fake smile she'd mastered. The one that said, I tolerate your existence, but would happily watch you get hit by a bus. But it was the stranger sitting across from me that really set off my internal alarm bells. Tall, blonde, looked like he'd been manufactured in some Ivy League pretty boy factory. His suit probably cost more than my car, and he had that smug confidence that only comes from a lifetime of having everything handed to you on a silver platter. He kept glancing at Gloria with this weird familiarity that made my skin crawl. Richard cleared his throat, his signature move when he was about to deliver one of his legendary verbal sucker punches. Everyone, I'd like you to meet James Worthington, he announced, raising his wine glass like he was proposing a toast at his own coronation. Harvard MBA, excellent family connections. And here came the pause that made my blood pressure spike. He'll be absolutely perfect for your position at the company after you get laid off and divorced. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. For a split second, you could have heard a pin drop in that cavernous dining room. Then the laughter started. First, Gloria's high-pitched giggle that sounded like fingernails on a chalkboard. Then, Miranda's drunken cackle. And finally, Richard's booming gap that echoed off the walls like thunder. They were all looking at me, waiting for the explosion, the dramatic meltdown, the satisfying collapse of my dignity. James had the decency to look uncomfortable. Shifting in his chair like his expensive suit had suddenly turned into a hair shirt. Poor bastard probably didn't realize he'd been invited to witness an execution. But the rest of them, they were eating this up like it was their personal Christmas feast of humiliation. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, that familiar surge of rage that wanted to flip the table and tell them all exactly where they could shove their family legacy. My hand tightened around my butter knife. Not that I was planning anything violent, mind you, but the weight of it was oddly comforting. Instead, I took a deep breath, reached for my roll, and buttered it with the kind of methodical precision that would have made a surgeon jealous. How nice, I said, my voice so calm and smooth it could have been used as a sleep aid. I took a bite of the roll, chewed thoughtfully, and looked directly at James. The kid was sweating now, probably wondering if he'd accidentally wandered into some weird family intervention. James, that's quite an interesting proposition. Did they happen to mention that the company is actually in my name? You know, legally speaking, the laughter died like someone had pulled the plug on a karaoke machine. Gloria's fork clattered against her plate. Oh, and James, I continued, still maintaining that eerily calm tone that was apparently freaking everyone out. Did they also mention the prenup? You know, that pesky little document that Gloria signed with such enthusiasm back when she thought I was her ticket to Easy Street. That's when Gloria made her mistake. She tried to take a sip of wine to cover her shock, but her hand was shaking so badly that she ended up choking on it like she was drowning in her own smugness. The coughing fit that followed was so violent, I thought she might actually hack up a lung right there on the imported china. Miranda sobered up real quick, her eyes going wide as dinner plates. Richard's face went through more color changes than a mood ring, settling somewhere between purple and apoplectic. James looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and disappear, probably wondering if he could still catch an Uber out of this nightmare. But me, I just sat there buttering another roll with the same infuriating calm, watching my dear family-in-law realize that their carefully orchestrated ambush had just blown up in their faces like a defective firework. Because here's the thing about predators. They get real uncomfortable when they suddenly realize their prey has bigger teeth than they do. The silence that followed was absolutely delicious. Seasoned with just the right amount of panic and garnished with a healthy dose of "oh, we might have miscalculated," it was shaping up to be the most entertaining Christmas dinner I'd had in years. Let me paint you a picture of what the last 5 years of my life have been like, because tonight's little Christmas ambush didn't just materialize out of thin air like some holiday miracle from hell. Oh no, this masterpiece of family dysfunction has been years in the making. Crafted with all the subtle artistry of a sledgehammer to the face. From day one of my marriage to Gloria, Richard Peaton made it crystal clear that I was about as welcome in his family as a vegetarian at a barbecue convention. The man had a gift for making you feel like you tracked dog through his pristine world just by existing in the same zip code. He perfected this little routine where he'd introduce me at social gatherings as Gloria's temporary accessory. Always with that shark smile that made you want to check if you still had all your limbs attached. Temporary accessory. Can you believe that, like I was some knockoff handbag she'd picked up at a discount store and would eventually upgrade when something shinier caught her eye? The first time he pulled that little gem, I thought maybe it was just his twisted idea of humor. Rich people have weird senses of humor, right? They probably think it's hilarious to light cigars with $100 bills or whatever the hell they do for kicks. But no, Richard meant every word. He'd say it at charity gall, at the country club, at family gatherings, anywhere there was an audience to witness my public humiliation. And the worst part, Gloria would just stand there smiling like he'd complimented her shoes, never once telling her dear daddy to maybe dial back the routine just a notch or two. Speaking of Gloria, my loving wife had turned parroting daddy's contempt into an Olympic sport. Woman could find fault with me breathing too loudly. I swear to God, according to her, I wasn't sophisticated enough for her circle of trust fund babies and social climbers. My suits weren't expensive enough. My car wasn't flashy enough. My conversation wasn't boring enough. Apparently, discussing stock portfolios and yacht maintenance is the height of intellectual discourse in their world. You just don't understand our lifestyle, she'd say with that condescending tone she perfected, like she was explaining quantum physics to a particularly slow golden retriever. My friends don't know what to make of you. Yeah. Well, her friends were a collection of Botoxed housewives whose greatest life achievement was marrying well and whose idea of hardship was when their personal trainer was running 5 minutes late. Then there was Miranda, Gloria's older sister, and living proof that money can't buy class, intelligence, or the ability to maintain a marriage for more than 18 months. The woman had gone through husbands like most people go through underwear frequently and with minimal emotional attachment. Husband number 1 was some investment banker who apparently lacked vision. Husband number 2 was a real estate mogul who didn't appreciate her creative spirit, which I'm pretty sure was code for he got tired of funding her shopping addiction and weekly spa treatments. But despite her spectacular track record of relationship failures, Miranda somehow felt qualified to offer marriage advice and commentary on my shortcomings as a spouse. You're just not flashy enough for Gloria. She'd slur during her third martini at family gatherings, swaying slightly like a designer-dressed palm tree in a hurricane. She needs someone with more presence. Presence, right? Because nothing says presence like being on your third divorce before you hit 40 and having your daddy pay your credit card bills because you spent your settlement money on a failed jewelry business and a yoga retreat in Bali. But here's what really got under my skin about this whole dysfunctional circus. The sheer audacity of it all. These people lived in a bubble of privilege so thick you could probably bounce quarters off it. Yet, they had the nerve to act like I was the problem. Like I was some charity case they'd graciously allowed into their golden kingdom out of the goodness of their hearts. Richard would hold court at family dinners, pontificating about legacy and breeding and the responsibility that comes with wealth while simultaneously treating me like I was some kind of social experiment gone wrong. He'd make these little comments about how new money, his charming term for anyone who hadn't inherited their fortune from Robert Barron great-great-granddaddies, just didn't understand the weight of tradition. The irony was so thick you could serve it with a fork. Because while Richard was busy lecturing me about tradition and legacy, he was also busy trying to figure out how to get his grubby little fingers deeper into my company's pie. Oh, he was subtle about it, suggesting strategic partnerships and family synergies, but I could see right through as he wanted control, and he figured marrying his daughter was the easiest way to get it. What made tonight different, though, was the sheer brazenness of it all. This wasn't just their usual death by 1,000 cuts routine. This was a full-scale military assault, complete with a replacement candidate sitting at their dinner table like some kind of corporate understudy waiting in the wings. They'd gotten cocky, drunk on their own sense of superiority and the illusion that they held all the cards. They thought they had me cornered, trapped in their web of social expectations and family obligations. They figured I'd just roll over and accept their verdict. Maybe slink away with my tail between my legs in whatever scraps they decided to throw my way out of the goodness of their hearts. But here's what they forgot in all their scheming and plotting. They'd been so busy treating me like the hired help that they'd never bothered to actually read the fine print. They'd been so convinced of their own cleverness that they'd overlooked one tiny little detail. I wasn't some desperate social climber who'd married into their family for access to their world. I brought my own world to the table. Thank you very much. And tonight I was finally going to remind them exactly who was holding the real power in this relationship. Poor James Worthington was starting to look like a deer caught in headlights. If deer wore 1,000 suits and had trust funds, that is. The kid was fidgeting with his napkin, probably wondering what the hell he'd gotten himself into, and whether his Harvard MBA had prepared him for whatever twisted family drama was unfolding around him like some sick soap opera. His perfectly styled blonde hair was starting to show signs of stress sweat, and I was pretty sure he was calculating the distance to the nearest exit. You had to feel sorry for the guy, really. Here he was, probably thinking he'd been invited to some exclusive holiday networking event where he'd smooch with the wealthy elite and maybe land himself a cushy executive position. Instead, he'd walk straight into the Peyton family's version of Game of Thrones, complete with backstabbing, power plays, and enough toxic family dynamics to fuel a therapist yacht payments for the next decade. Richard, being the master manipulator he was, had clearly painted James a very specific picture of tonight's little gathering. I could practically hear the pitch meeting in my head. All smooth talk and carefully curated half-truths designed to make this whole setup look legitimate. Richard probably sold it as some kind of smooth corporate transition, like I was some failing CEO who'd graciously agreed to step aside for the good of the company. James comes highly recommended. Richard had undoubtedly said in that polished boardroom voice of his, the one he used when he was trying to sell someone a pile of horseshit wrapped in fancy paper. Excellent pedigree, stellar academic record, exactly the kind of fresh blood we need to take the company to the next level. He probably threw around some business buzzwords. Synergy, optimization, strategic realignment. The kind of corporate speak that sounds impressive but means absolutely nothing. What Richard conveniently forgot to mention in his recruitment pitch was that this whole family empire he loved to brag about was built on a foundation that had my name stamped all over it in permanent ink. See, while the Pembertons were busy playing their little social hierarchy games, I'd actually been building something real from the ground up. It started with my grandfather's money, not a fortune by Pimpton standards, but enough seed capital to get a decent business off the ground if you weren't an idiot about it. Gramps had been a practical man, the kind of guy who understood that money was a tool, not a trophy. He'd left me enough to either blow on fancy toys and expensive mistakes or invest in something that might actually grow into something substantial. Guess which option I chose? While my future in-laws were busy maintaining their image and attending charity galas where they could see and be seen by other rich people doing absolutely nothing productive, I was grinding it out in a cramped office above a Chinese restaurant, learning every aspect of the business from the ground up. I wasn't above answering my own phones, cleaning my own office, or pulling 18-hour days when a big contract was on the line. The company grew slowly at first. A few small contracts, some modest profits, nothing that would make headlines or impress anyone at the country club. But I reinvested every penny, hired smart people, and focused on actually delivering value instead of just talking about it. While Richard was pontificating about business philosophy at dinner parties, I was building relationships with clients who actually mattered. By the time I met Gloria, the company was already turning serious profit. Not Peyton-level old money, but enough to catch Richard's attention when he started sniffing around for new investment opportunities. That's when things got interesting because Richard saw my success and immediately started calculating how he could get his hooks into it. The man was smooth. I'll give him that. He didn't come at me with guns blazing, demanding equity or control. Instead, he played the long game. The concerned father-in-law just looking out for his daughter's financial future. He suggested bringing him on as an investor, someone who could provide strategic guidance and help navigate the complexities of scaling a business. "You've built something impressive," he'd said during one of our early conversations, pouring me a scotch that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "But there's a difference between building a business and building an empire. I could help you see the bigger picture." What he really meant was that he wanted in on the action, and he figured marrying his daughter was the easiest way to get a piece of the pie. Richard had spent his whole life living off inherited wealth, watching money make money without actually creating anything new. My company represented something he'd never had, the satisfaction of building something from nothing. So he came on board as what he liked to call a strategic partner, bringing his connections, his capital, and his insufferable ego to what had been my lean, efficient operation. Suddenly, we had fancy offices in a downtown high-rise, expense accounts that would make a Fortune 500 CEO blush, and enough overhead to choke a horse. But here's what Richard never bothered to understand. Probably because he'd never actually built anything himself. Legal ownership and operational control are two very different things. He could strut around the office, hold meetings about strategic direction, and impress clients with his silver-haired gravitas, but at the end of the day, every single share of stock, every asset, every contract, and every intellectual property agreement had my name on it. The paperwork was airtight because I'd learned early on that when you're dealing with sharks, you better make damn sure your cage is locked. My lawyers had crafted agreements so bulletproof that even a team of Harvard MBAs couldn't find a loophole, which was ironic considering we currently had one sitting at the dinner table looking increasingly uncomfortable. James was starting to pick up on the subtext, his eyes darting between Richard's increasingly strained smile and my unnaturally calm demeanor. You could practically see the gears turning in his head as he started to realize that maybe, just maybe, this whole situation wasn't quite what it had been presented to be. Gloria had recovered from her wine-choking incident with all the grace of a cat landing after falling off a fence. Technically successful, but not fooling anyone about how smooth the whole process actually was. Her face had returned to its normal shade of entitled pale, and that familiar smirk was creeping back across her lips like oil spreading across water. My dear wife had apparently decided that my little revelation about company ownership was just some kind of bluff, a desperate attempt to salvage my dignity in the face of their perfectly orchestrated coup. She leaned forward in her chair, resting her elbows on the table in a way that would have horrified her finishing school teachers, fixing James with the kind of predatory smile that had probably launched 1,000 bad decisions. "James, you simply must ignore my husband's theatrics," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of false sweetness that could give you diabetes just from listening to it. "He's always been prone to exaggeration when he feels cornered." The condescension in her tone was so thick you could have spread it on toast. This was classic Gloria. Dismiss, deflect, and pretend that reality was negotiable as long as you had enough confidence and the right breeding to back it up. She perfected this technique over years of getting her way through sheer force of privilege. And she wasn't about to let a little thing like facts get in the way of her narrative. "James has the most impressive credentials," she continued, launching into what sounded suspiciously like a sales pitch she'd rehearsed in front of a mirror. "Harvard Business School naturally graduated summa cum laude. His thesis on corporate restructuring in the digital age was simply revolutionary, wasn't it, James?" Poor James nodded along like a bobblehead doll, though I could see the uncertainty flickering behind his eyes like a neon sign in a thunderstorm. The kid was smart enough to sense that something wasn't adding up, but not experienced enough to trust his instincts over the confident assertions of people who clearly moved in circles he aspired to join. "And the connections he brings to the table," Gloria gushed, warming to her theme like a revival preacher getting worked up about salvation, "are simply extraordinary. His family has ties to some of the most influential investment firms on the East Coast. Tell him about the Wellington Group, James." James cleared his throat, looking like he wished he could disappear into his chair cushions. "Well, my father serves on their advisory board," he managed, his voice lacking the confidence you'd expect from someone who was supposedly about to take over a major company. "They specialize in growth capital for mid-market enterprises." "Exactly." Gloria clapped her hands together like she'd just witnessed a particularly impressive magic trick. "Growth capital. That's precisely what we need to take this company to the next level. Isn't that right, Daddy?" Richard nodded sagely, playing his role in this little theater production with the kind of practiced ease that made you wonder how many other families they'd bulldozed with this same routine. "Absolutely, sweetheart. James represents the kind of fresh thinking that can transform a stagnant business into a dynamic growth engine." The irony was so rich it should have come with its own wine pairing. Here they were talking about transforming my stagnant business. The same business that had been consistently profitable for the past 8 years. The same business that had allowed Richard to upgrade his lifestyle and Gloria to maintain her shopping addiction. The same business that was currently funding the very dinner we were sitting at. Miranda, not to be left out of the character assassination, raised her wine glass in a mock toast. To fresh blood, she declared with the kind of drunken enthusiasm that suggested she'd moved well past the point of caring about subtlety. "God knows this family could use some excitement. Things have been positively dreary with all this talk about steady growth and sustainable practices." She made air quotes around the phrases like they were obscene words. "Miranda's right," Gloria continued, apparently emboldened by her sister's support. "James brings exactly the kind of innovative thinking that we've been lacking. He understands the importance of expansion, of taking calculated risks to maximize returns. Don't you, James?" The poor bastard was starting to sweat more visibly now, probably realizing that he was being used as a weapon in someone else's war without fully understanding the battlefield. "I believe in aggressive growth strategies when market conditions are favorable," he said carefully, like he was walking through a minefield in the dark. "See," Gloria turned to me with triumph written all over her face. "That's the kind of vision that could really put us on the map. No more of this conservative smalling approach that's been holding us back." Small inking approach. That's what she called the business strategy that had built the company from a one-man operation in a rented office to a multi-million-dollar enterprise with offices in 3 cities. That's what she called the careful planning and risk management that had allowed us to weather economic downturns while our competitors were folding faster than lawn chairs in a hurricane. Richard leaned back in his chair, radiating the kind of patriarchal satisfaction that suggested he thought this whole conversation was going according to plan. "James, you should know that Gloria has always had an excellent eye for talent," he said, managing to make it sound both like a compliment to his daughter and a subtle threat to me. "When she recognizes potential, she's rarely wrong." The subtext was clear as crystal. Gloria had recognized James's potential in the same way she'd once recognized mine back when I was useful to their family's ambitions. Now that they decided I was no longer serving their purposes, James was being positioned as the shiny new toy that would solve all their problems and expand their empire. But what they still didn't seem to grasp despite my earlier hints was that there was no empire to expand. There was no family business to transition. There was just my company, my assets, and my legal protections. All of which were completely beyond their reach. No matter how many Harvard MBAs they trotted out or how confidently they talked about fresh thinking and innovative approaches, I sat there methodically working my way through my dinner, watching them build their elaborate fantasy castle on a foundation that didn't exist, and I had to admire their commitment to the delusion. The atmosphere in that dining room had turned more toxic than a chemical spill at a perfume factory. But I was sitting in the middle of it all like the eye of a hurricane, perfectly calm while chaos swirled around me. Richard was holding court like some kind of delusional emperor, gesturing with his wine glass as he pontificated about the glorious future of our family enterprise. Gloria was practically glowing with vindictive satisfaction, shooting me little sideways glances to see if her verbal daggers were finding their mark. And Miranda, well, Miranda was just along for the ride. Giggling at inappropriate moments and making commentary that would have been cutting if it weren't coming from someone whose life choices read like a cautionary tale about what happens when you have more money than sense. "You know what the problem has been all along," Richard declared, warming to his favorite subject, namely everything that was supposedly wrong with me and my approach to business. "There's been a fundamental lack of vision, a failure to understand that in today's market, you either grow or you die. There's no middle ground for playing it safe." Playing it safe, right? Because apparently building a company from scratch, navigating multiple economic downturns and maintaining consistent profitability for nearly a decade was just me being overly cautious. Never mind that half the visionary companies Richard admired had either gone bankrupt, been investigated by the SEC, or collapsed under the weight of their own aggressive expansion strategies. "Exactly, Daddy." Gloria chimed in because agreeing with Richard was practically her full-time job at this point. "We've been thinking too small. James understands that sometimes you have to take big risks to achieve big rewards. Don't you, James?" Poor James was looking increasingly like he wanted to crawl under the table and hide. Every time they dragged him into the conversation, he'd nod and make noncommittal sounds, but you could see the growing realization in his eyes that he'd somehow become the star of a show he'd never auditioned for. The kid was probably starting to wonder if this was how hostile takeovers always worked, or if he'd just stumbled into the world's most dysfunctional job interview. "I believe in calculated risk-taking." James managed his voice getting smaller with each forced contribution to their little performance. "But it's important to have a solid foundation before pursuing aggressive growth strategies." Miranda nearly snorted wine through her nose at that one. "Foundation," she slurred like the word was some kind of hilarious punchline. "That's exactly the kind of boring conservative thinking that's been holding us back. Sometimes you have to blow up the foundation to build something truly spectacular." Coming from a woman who'd managed to blow up 2 marriages and a small business venture in the space of 5 years, this was particularly rich advice. But Miranda was on a roll, emboldened by alcohol and the mistaken belief that her track record of spectacular failures somehow qualified her as a business strategist. Richard nodded approvingly at his older daughter's contribution, as if she'd just delivered some profound wisdom instead of drunken rambling. "Miranda makes an excellent point. Sometimes disruption is necessary for transformation. You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs." The corporate cliches were flying thick and fast now. Each one more meaningless than the last. These people talked about business like they'd learned everything they knew from motivational posters and airport bookstore bestsellers. They had the vocabulary down pat, but absolutely no understanding of what any of it actually meant in practice. The thing is, Gloria continued, clearly enjoying herself now. We've been held back by someone who's more interested in preserving the status quo than seizing opportunities. Someone who thinks steady growth is more important than market domination. The way she said steady growth made it sound like some kind of personal character flaw, like being responsible with money, was a sign of moral weakness. This from a woman who'd never held a real job in her life, whose idea of financial planning was making sure her credit cards had enough available balance for her next shopping spree. But that's all going to change now, Richard announced with the kind of confidence that only comes from being completely divorced from reality. With James on board, we'll finally have the leadership we need to reach our full potential. Real leadership with the vision and courage to make the tough decisions. Real leadership. The implication was clear. I wasn't real leadership, just some kind of placeholder who'd been keeping the seat warm until the right person came along. Never mind that this right person had been handpicked by people who collectively couldn't run a lemonade stand without driving it into bankruptcy. I kept my mouth shut and continued eating, letting them build their elaborate fantasy while I mentally cataloged every word, every implication, every casual insult. They thought my silence meant defeat, that I was finally accepting the inevitable. In reality, I was just giving them enough rope to hang themselves with, and they were braiding it into a noose with impressive enthusiasm. Miranda raised her glass again, swaying slightly in her chair. To new beginnings, she declared, though her words were starting to slur together like she was speaking through a mouthful of marbles. And to finally getting rid of dead weight. Dead weight. That's what they thought of me. Not the person who'd built the company they were so eager to control. Not the one who'd made their comfortable lifestyle possible, but dead weight that needed to be jettisoned for the good of the enterprise. The irony was so thick you could have cut it with a butter knife. Here they were, three people whose combined business experience wouldn't fill a postcard, talking about my failures and limitations while planning to hand over control of a multi-million-dollar company to someone they'd known for all of 5 minutes. But I just sat there nodding occasionally, refilling my wine glass, and smiling that infuriating smile that was clearly starting to get under their skin. Because the beautiful thing about letting people hang themselves with their own words is that you don't have to do any of the heavy lifting. You just have to be patient enough to watch them tie the knots. The moment had finally arrived, that perfect intersection of their arrogance and my patience running out simultaneously. Richard was in the middle of another one of his grandiose speeches about our family wealth and how it had expanded exponentially under his strategic guidance, gesturing with his wine glass like he was conducting some invisible orchestra of success. The man was so drunk on his own that he'd apparently forgotten the basic principle of not claiming credit for other people's work, especially when those people were sitting right across the table with access to all the receipts. I set down my wine glass with the kind of deliberate precision that made everyone at the table unconsciously hold their breath. The crystal made a soft chiming sound against the mahogany table and suddenly the room got so quiet you could have heard a trust fund baby's conscience drop if such a thing existed, which was highly debatable. That's interesting, Richard, I said, my voice carrying the same conversational tone I might use to comment on the weather or ask someone to pass the salt. This expansion of our family wealth. Could you be more specific about which assets you're referring to? Richard's smile faltered for just a microsecond, like a record skipping, but he recovered quickly. The man was nothing if not committed to his performance. Well, naturally, I'm talking about the tremendous growth we've seen across all our business ventures. The company has tripled in value since I came on board. Ah, the company. I nodded thoughtfully as if this was news to me. And when you say our company, you're referring to the business that was incorporated under my name 3 years before I even met Gloria. The one where every single share certificate has my signature on it. The temperature in the room seemed to drop about 10 degrees. Gloria's fork froze halfway to her mouth. A piece of prime rib dangling from it like she'd suddenly forgotten how eating worked. Miranda's wine glass stopped midway to her lips, her eyes going wide with the kind of dawning horror usually reserved for people who realize they've been walking around with toilet paper stuck to their shoe. But I wasn't done. Hell, I was just getting started. And Richard, when you mentioned the headquarters building, that beautiful downtown office space that's been such a symbol of our success, you do remember that the deed is in my name alone, right? Purchased with funds from my personal accounts, financed through loans that I personally guaranteed. Richard's face was going through more color changes than a chameleon having an identity crisis. Now, see here, he began, but I held up a hand to stop him. Politely, of course. I was nothing if not civilized. Oh, but wait, there's more. I continued, channeling my inner infomercial host. Those patents that Miranda was bragging about to James earlier, you know, the ones that form the backbone of our technological advantage, those were developed by the R&D team I hired using equipment I purchased in facilities I own. And before you ask, yes, Every single patent application lists me as the primary inventor and owner. James was looking back and forth between us like he was watching the world's most expensive tennis match. Probably wondering if his LinkedIn profile was up to date in case he needed to start job hunting again real soon. The poor bastard was finally starting to understand that he hadn't been invited to a corporate transition meeting. He'd been cast as an unwitting extra in someone else's revenge fantasy. Even those offshore accounts that you've been so proud of, I pressed on. Really hitting my stride now. The ones holding our diversified investment portfolio. Well, guess whose social security number is on every single one of those account applications? The silence that followed was so complete it had its own gravitational pull. You could practically see the gears grinding in their heads as they tried to process what I was telling them. For years, they'd operated under the assumption that marriage meant merger. That saying I do had somehow magically transformed my assets into community property right for the taking. Miranda was the first to break, her voice coming out as barely more than a whisper. But the lawyers said a yes, the lawyers. I smiled, and it wasn't a particularly nice smile. Your lawyers said a lot of things, didn't they? Unfortunately, they were operating under some fundamental misunderstandings about how my business was structured. You see, when you build a company from scratch and you're paranoid enough to protect every asset with separate legal entities, trusts, and ironclad incorporation documents, things get a bit more complicated than your average rich family merger. Richard tried to rally, his voice gaining volume as if sheer force could somehow change the legal reality. This is ridiculous. You can't simply claim ownership of everything. There are partnership agreements, investment contracts, signed documents. You're absolutely right. I agreed cheerfully. There are signed documents, lots of them, actually. Every single one of which clearly states that your role in the company is strictly advisory with no ownership stake, no voting rights, and no claim to assets in the event of exactly what's happening right now. Gloria finally found her voice, though it came out about 3 octaves higher than usual. This is impossible. The prenup covered business assets acquired during the marriage. The prenup covered assets acquired during the marriage, I corrected gently. But since the company, the building, the patents, and about 90% of our current assets were established before our marriage, they fall under the separate property clause. You know, the one your own lawyer explained to you before you signed it, the one you said you understood completely. The beautiful thing about thorough documentation is that it's very hard to argue with when every contract is signed, witnessed, notarized, and filed in triplicate. People's memories of what they thought they agreed to become somewhat irrelevant. James cleared his throat nervously. Perhaps I should go, he suggested, probably calculating how quickly he could call an Uber and disappear from this nightmare. Nonsense, James, I said warmly. You should stay for dessert. I think you'll find the rest of this conversation quite educational. The look on Gloria's face was priceless, like someone had just told her that her platinum credit card had been declined at Tiffany's. But I wasn't finished with my little Christmas presentation. Oh, no. We were just getting to the good part. The piece to resistance that would make this holiday dinner one for the family history books. See, while they'd been busy planning my professional funeral, they'd gotten sloppy about covering their own tracks, and I'd been a very attentive student of their careless behavior. But you know what, Gloria? I said, settling back in my chair like I was about to tell a particularly amusing anecdote. Since we're being so honest about everything tonight, maybe we should clear the air about some other little details that have been bothering me lately. The way her eyes narrowed told me she knew exactly where this was heading. But she was trapped now, committed to playing out this scene in front of her family, and poor James, who was looking more and more like he regretted every life decision that had led him to this moment. I couldn't help but notice how busy you've been lately, I continued conversationally. All those important business lunches, all those afternoon meetings that run so terribly long. You've been practically devoted to your schedule. Richard leaned forward, probably sensing that the conversation was about to take another sharp turn into territory he hadn't prepared for. What exactly are you implying? He demanded, though his voice lacked the commanding authority he'd been wielding earlier. Oh, I'm not implying anything, Richard. I'm about to state some facts, actually. Very specific. Very well-documented facts. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone, setting it on the table like I was laying down a royal flush. See, when your spouse starts having mysterious afternoon appointments 3 times a week, a reasonable person might get curious about where all that time is being spent. Gloria's face went from pale to gray, like someone had just drained all the blood out of her body through a straw. You've been spying on me, she whispered, though it came out more like an accusation than a denial. Spying is such an ugly word, I replied, enjoying the way she flinched. I prefer to think of it as taking a healthy interest in my wife's well-being. After all, when someone starts spending every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday afternoon at the St. Regis Hotel, ordering room service for two, and charging it all to a credit card that's mysteriously linked to our joint checking account. A loving husband might start to worry. The silence that followed was so profound you could have held a seance in it. Miranda's wine glass slipped from her fingers and shattered against her plate, sending pieces of crystal scattering across the table like tiny glittering accusations. James looked like he was mentally updating his resume and wondering if his old college roommate was still hiring at that investment firm in Denver. You see the thing about the St. Regis? I continued, warming to my theme like a prosecutor who just found DNA evidence, is that they're very thorough with their record keeping. Excellent customer service, really. When I called to inquire about my wife's frequent visits, they were more than happy to confirm the dates, times, and even the room numbers. Apparently, Gloria has been quite the regular customer. Gloria tried to speak but only managed a strangled sort of choking sound that might have been words if words could die of embarrassment. And here's where it gets really interesting, I said, pulling up something on my phone with the casual air of someone showing vacation photos. Because when I started looking into the credit card statements, just basic financial housekeeping, I discovered some fascinating patterns. Not just the hotel charges, but the shopping trips that always seemed to happen right after those long lunch meetings. Very expensive shopping trips. Actually, Richard's face was now roughly the color of the burgundy wine staining the tablecloth from Miranda's dropped glass. "This is preposterous," he sputtered, though his protest lacked any real conviction. "You can't just but I can," I interrupted smoothly. "Because you see, when someone uses a joint credit card to fund their extracurricular activities, both account holders have access to all the transaction details. Amazing what you can learn from a few months of visa statements and hotel receipts." I swiped to another screen on my phone, holding it up so everyone could see the evidence I'd been collecting like a dedicated scrapbooker of infidelity. For instance, did you know that Gloria has been treating herself to some very expensive lingerie from La Pera? Curious choice for someone who's been claiming she's too tired for any kind of intimate relations at home. Gloria finally found her voice, though it came out as more of a squeak than actual speech. "How dare you humiliate me like this?" "Humiliate you?" I laughed, and it wasn't a particularly pleasant sound. "Sweetheart, I'm not humiliating you. I'm just sharing some interesting financial data with the family. After all, transparency is so important in family businesses, don't you think?" Miranda was now openly gaping at her sister, her alcohol fog brain finally processing what was being revealed. "Gloria, you didn't," she started, then trailed off as the implications hit her like a brick to the face. "Oh, but she did," I confirmed helpfully. 3 times a week, like clockwork. Always the same suite. Always charged to our joint account. Always followed by shopping trips that would make a Kardashian blush. Very predictable schedule, actually. Quite romantic in its own way." James was now actively trying to sink into his chair, probably wishing he could activate some kind of ejector seat and launch himself directly out of the dining room and into the safety of witness protection. "And the best part," I continued because I was really enjoying myself now, "is that I have timestamps, photographs of credit card receipts, and even some interesting text message screenshots that Gloria accidentally copied to our shared iCloud account. Modern technology is just wonderful for maintaining accurate records, don't you think?" The devastation on their faces was more satisfying than anything we'd been served for dinner. If I thought Gloria's face had been entertaining when I dropped the affair bombshell, it was nothing compared to watching Richard's expression as I shifted my attention to him. The man went through more color changes than a sunset, cycling from his usual arrogant pink to a sickly yellow that made him look like he'd been dining exclusively on expired mayonnaise for the past month. See, while Gloria's little extracurricular activities were personally insulting, Richard's financial shenanigans were about to become legally problematic, and he was smart enough to know it. "Now, Richard," I said, setting my phone down and giving him my full attention like a cat that had just spotted a particularly fat mouse. "Since we're having such a productive conversation about transparency and accountability, maybe we should discuss some of your recent business expenses." The old man's Adam's apple bobbed like a fishing lure in choppy water. He tried to maintain that patrician composure that had served him so well over the years. But sweat was starting to bead on his forehead despite the dining room's perfect climate control. "I don't know what you're implying," he said, though his voice had lost that commanding authority he'd been wielding earlier. Now he just sounded like a man trying to convince himself that the walls weren't closing in. "Oh, I'm not implying anything," I replied cheerfully. "I'm about to lay out some very specific facts about how you've been treating the company expense account like your personal piggy bank. See, the beautiful thing about modern accounting software is that it tracks everything. Every transaction, every receipt, every little financial decision gets logged, categorized, and stored forever." Richard's hands were trembling slightly now, And he'd gone completely still in his chair like a deer that had just realized it was standing in the middle of a highway with headlights bearing down on it. Miranda was staring at her father with growing horror, probably starting to understand that this Christmas dinner was turning into the kind of family gathering that ends with lawyers and possibly federal investigators. For instance, I continued, pulling out a manila folder that I'd been saving for just this moment. Let's talk about that wine collection you've been building. According to the receipts I have here, the company has purchased approximately $47,000 worth of vintage wines over the past 18 months. Now, I'm sure you can explain why a tech consulting firm needs a wine cellar that rivals most five-star restaurants. The folder hit the table with a satisfying thud, and Richard's eyes fixed on it like it was a live grenade with the pin pulled. James was now openly staring, probably wondering if he'd accidentally wandered into some kind of white-collar crime documentary. Then there's the country club fees, I went on, flipping through pages with the methodical precision of an IRS auditor who'd found their favorite kind of audit. $68,000 annually for memberships at 3 different clubs, all charged to the company under client entertainment. Fascinating how much entertaining you've been doing at the yacht club considering we don't have any clients who own boats. Richard tried to speak but only managed a sound that was somewhere between a cough and a death rattle. His carefully constructed image of sophisticated business leadership was crumbling faster than a house of cards in a tornado. And speaking of boats, I continued because I was really hitting my stride. Now, let's discuss that beautiful 42-foot Sunseeker that's been docked in Miami for the past 8 months. The one that's been charged to the company as a mobile office for client meetings in the Southeast region. Very creative accounting, Richard. Too bad we don't actually have any clients in the Southeast region. Miranda gasped audibly, wine and shock combining to make her look like she'd just witnessed a particularly gruesome magic trick. Daddy, you told me that boat belonged to the Weatherbees. The Weatherbees? I laughed and it wasn't a nice sound. No, Miranda, the boat belongs to the company. Or rather, it did until about 6 hours ago when I had it seized by the marina and put up for immediate sale. Amazing how quickly these things can move when you have proper legal documentation. Richard finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. You can't do that. That's theft. I'll have you arrested. Theft. I raised an eyebrow, genuinely amused by his audacity. Richard, you charged a $500,000 yacht to a company expense account without authorization from the actual owner of the company. If anyone's going to be talking to law enforcement about theft, it's probably not going to be me. The implications were hitting him now like a series of slaps to the face. His mouth opened and closed silently, probably running through all the possible legal ramifications of what he'd been doing. Corporate fraud, embezzlement, misappropriation of funds. The charges were stacking up like poker chips, and he was holding a losing hand. But wait, there's more, I said, channeling my inner game show host again. Let's talk about those consulting fees you've been paying yourself. $30,000 a month for strategic advisory services. That's interesting math considering you show up to the office maybe twice a week and spend most of that time playing golf with your buddies or reading the Wall Street Journal in your office. James was now actively trying to disappear into his chair, probably calculating how fast he could get to his car and drive directly to the nearest FBI field office to offer his services as a witness. Gloria was staring at her father with a mixture of horror and dawning realization that her comfortable lifestyle was about to come crashing down around her ears. The really beautiful part, I continued, savoring every word like fine wine, is that I have documentation for all of it. Bank statements, receipts, email authorizations that you forged using company letterhead, even some interesting voice recordings from board meetings where you discussed reallocating resources for maximum strategic impact. Richard's face had now achieved a shade of gray that suggested his cardiovascular system was having some serious disagreements with his current stress levels. This is impossible, he whispered. The lawyers reviewed everything. The board approved. The board approved what you told them. I interrupted. Unfortunately for you, what you told them and what you actually did were two very different things. And since I happen to be the majority shareholder and CEO, I've been having some very interesting conversations with both my lawyers and some folks at the federal level who take a dim view of corporate financial irregularities. The explosion, when it finally came, was more spectacular than I could have hoped for. It started with Gloria, who apparently decided that screaming was the appropriate response to having her entire world systematically dismantled over Christmas dinner. Her voice reached a pitch that probably violated several noise ordinances and definitely threatened the structural integrity of the crystal chandelier hanging overhead. "This is insane," she shrieked, her carefully applied makeup now streaking down her face like watercolors in a thunderstorm. "You can't just destroy our family because you're having some kind of midlife crisis. This is our life, our money, our future." The possessive pronouns were flying fast and furious, Which was ironic considering we just spent the better part of an hour establishing that none of it was actually ours in any legal sense. But Gloria had never been one to let facts interfere with her emotional outbursts, and tonight was clearly not going to be the exception to that rule. Your money? I asked mildly, which only seemed to fuel her hysteria. Gloria, sweetheart, you haven't earned a dime in your entire adult life. The closest you've come to generating income was that time you sold your old Hermes bags on eBay, and even then, you lost money because you forgot to factor in shipping costs. Miranda chose that moment to join the chorus. Her wine-soaked brain finally processing the full scope of what was happening. She started crying. Not the delicate, photogenic tears of a movie heroine, but the ugly, snotty sobbing of someone whose comfortable delusions were being shattered with surgical precision. But what about the family reputation? She wailed, apparently under the impression that their reputation was something worth preserving. What will people say when they find out about all of this? What will people say? I repeated, genuinely curious about her priorities. Miranda, your family's reputation is about to be the least of your problems. When the IRS starts auditing Richard's tax returns and the FBI begins investigating corporate fraud charges, I'm pretty sure social standing is going to take a backseat to avoiding federal prison time. That's when Richard finally lost whatever remained of his composure. The man who'd spent years lecturing me about dignity and proper behavior started bellowing like a wounded bull, his face turning purple as spittle flew from his mouth. You ungrateful bastard, he roared, pounding his fist on the table hard enough to make the china rattle. After everything we've done for you, after we welcomed you into this family, welcome me. I couldn't help but laugh at that one. Richard, you've spent 5 years treating me like something you scraped off your shoe. You've insulted me, undermined me, and stolen from me. And now you want to talk about betrayal. That's rich even for you. We made you, he continued, completely abandoning any pretense of rational conversation. Without this family, without our connections, without our guidance, you'd still be nothing. A nobody from nowhere with delusions of grandeur. The irony was so thick you could have bottled it and sold it as a luxury condiment. Here was a man who'd spent his entire adult life living off inherited wealth, who'd never built anything or created any value, accusing me of being nothing while simultaneously trying to steal the company I'd built from scratch. James, bless his heart, finally decided he'd had enough of being a captive audience to this family meltdown. He stood up slowly like he was trying not to startle any dangerous animals and cleared his throat politely. I think maybe I should go, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. This seems like a private family matter. Gloria spun around to face him, mascara streaking down her cheeks like war paint. You can't leave. We had an agreement. You were going to I was going to what? James interrupted, finally showing some spine. Take over a company from someone who legally owns it? Participate in what sounds suspiciously like fraud? No, thank you. I may be ambitious, but I'm not stupid. He was already reaching for his coat, moving with the kind of urgency usually reserved for escaping natural disasters. Smart kid. He'd probably go far in life, assuming he learned to vet his business opportunities more carefully in the future. Don't you dare walk away from us. Miranda shrieked at his retreating form. The Worthington family has been nothing for generations. We're offering you a chance to be part of something important. But James was already halfway to the door, probably calculating how quickly he could get to his car and delete every phone number associated with this evening from his contacts. I didn't blame him. If I'd been in his position, I would have been sprinting for the exit about 2 revelations ago. With James's departure, the remaining members of the Pimpton family seemed to lose whatever was left of their collective minds. Gloria was now alternating between screaming about betrayal and sobbing about her ruined future. Miranda was rambling incoherently about family honor and social consequences. And Richard was still bellowing about ingratitude and legal action, apparently convinced that volume could somehow change the fundamental reality of corporate law. I sat in the middle of this chaos like the eye of a hurricane, calmly finishing my wine while they tore themselves apart. It was actually quite peaceful in a way. After years of walking on eggshells around their egos and enduring their casual cruelty, watching them completely lose their composure was surprisingly therapeutic. Finally, when it became clear that they were just going to keep cycling through the same accusations and threats on an endless loop, I stood up and buttoned my coat. The simple action seemed to shock them into momentary silence, like they'd forgotten I was still capable of independent movement. Well, I said, checking my watch with the casual air of someone wrapping up a pleasant social evening. This has been absolutely fascinating, but I think it's time for me to go. Thank you for such an enlightening Christmas dinner. Gloria stared at me like I just announced my intention to join a circus. You can't just leave, she gasped. We need to talk about this. We need to figure out how to fix this. Fix this. I smiled, and it wasn't a particularly warm expression. "Gloria, there's nothing to fix. There's just reality. And reality is that your comfortable little fantasy is over." I walked toward the door, savoring the sound of my footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet dining room. At the threshold, I turned back for one last look at the wreckage of their evening. "Merry Christmas," I said pleasantly. "By New Year's, you'll be hearing from my lawyers." The drive to my townhouse felt like being released from prison after serving a sentence I'd never deserved in the first place. Every mile between me and the Gothic mansion of dysfunction was another weight lifted off my shoulders, another chain broken from around my ankles. The snow was falling in fat lazy flakes that turned the city into something out of a postcard. And for the first time in years, I actually appreciated the beauty of it instead of just seeing it as another expensive inconvenience that would require someone to shovel the driveway and salt the walkways. The townhouse was my little secret, a piece of real estate that I'd purchased 3 years ago under the name of one of my holding companies. It was nothing spectacular by Pimpton standards, just a modest 3-bedroom brick building in a quiet neighborhood where people minded their own business and didn't give a damn about your pedigree or your portfolio. But it was mine, completely and totally mine. And tonight, that fact felt more valuable than all the gold fixtures and imported marble in Richard's mansion. I'd bought it originally as an investment property, but over the past year, I'd been quietly moving my personal belongings there bit by bit. Nothing obvious, nothing that would tip off Gloria's suspicious nature, just the gradual migration of items that actually mattered to me. My grandfather's desk, the books I collected over the years, the photographs from before I'd made the mistake of thinking I could build a life with someone who saw me as a stepping stone rather than a human being. As I pulled into the narrow driveway, my phone started buzzing like an angry wasp trapped in a jar. First, it was Gloria, her number flashing on the screen with the kind of desperate persistence that suggested she'd moved past anger into full-scale panic mode. Then, Richard, probably calling from his study, where he was frantically going through contracts and legal documents, looking for some loophole that would save his stolen yacht and his embezzled wine collection. Even Miranda managed to dial my number, though given her alcohol consumption this evening. That was probably more luck than motor skills. I let them all go to voicemail. After 5 years of jumping every time one of them called, of dropping whatever I was doing to attend to their manufactured crises and fabricated emergencies, the simple act of ignoring their demands felt revolutionary. Each ignored call was a small declaration of independence, a tiny rebellion that was growing into something much larger. Inside the townhouse, I poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon, the good stuff that I kept here instead of the overpriced scotch that Richard insisted on serving at family gatherings. This was bourbon with character. Bourbon that had been aged properly instead of being chosen for its price tag and its ability to impress people who wouldn't know quality if it bit them on their artificially enhanced asses. I settled into the leather chair by the window, the one that faced out onto the quiet street where normal people live normal lives without the constant drama of corporate espionage and family warfare. The silence was extraordinary. No Gloria complaining about some imagined slight from her social circle. No Richard pontificating about business strategies he didn't understand. No Miranda's drunken commentary on everything from my wardrobe choices to my failure to appreciate their family's superiority. Just blessed, beautiful silence. The text messages started arriving around 10 o'clock. A steady stream of increasingly desperate digital pleas that ranged from pathetic to threatening to completely delusional. Gloria's messages were a masterclass in emotional manipulation, cycling through anger, self-pity, and hollow promises of change. "We can work this out," she texted. "Don't throw away everything we've built together." As if she'd built anything other than an impressive collection of credit card debt and extramarital affairs. Richard's texts were more direct, alternating between legal threats and attempted intimidation. "You'll regret this," he warned. "I have connections you can't imagine." The irony was delicious. A man whose connections were about to become his biggest liability, threatening someone who just demonstrated exactly how powerless those connections really were when faced with actual legal documentation and federal oversight. Miranda's contributions were largely incoherent, a stream of consciousness ramble about family loyalty and social responsibility that read like it had been dictated by someone having a nervous breakdown in a wine cellar. I almost felt sorry for her, but then I remembered her years of casual cruelty and decided that some people deserve their hangovers, both literal and metaphorical. Around midnight, the calls and texts finally stopped. Probably because they'd exhausted themselves or passed out, or possibly because their lawyers had advised them to shut up before they incriminated themselves further. The sudden silence was even more satisfying than the bourbon, which was saying something. I raised my glass to the window, looking out at the snow-covered street where Christmas lights twinkled in windows and normal families were probably sleeping peacefully, dreaming of presents and vacation days instead of forensic accountants and federal investigations. "Merry Christmas to me," I said aloud and meant every word. The freedom was intoxicating in a way that no amount of money or social status could match. For the first time in years, I could make decisions without considering how they would affect Gloria's reputation or Richard's business schemes or Miranda's delicate sensibilities. I could wake up tomorrow and do whatever the hell I wanted. Go wherever I felt like going, see whoever I chose to see. The company was mine legally and completely protected by contracts so airtight that even a team of Harvard lawyers couldn't find a crack. The assets were mine, secured in trusts and holding companies that would take years to unravel, even if someone had legitimate legal standing to challenge them, which they didn't. Even the house we'd shared was technically a company property, which meant Gloria would be looking for new accommodations sooner rather than later. But more than the financial victory, more than the legal vindication, was the simple fact that I was finally free from their toxic influence. No more walking on eggshells. No more swallowing insults. No more pretending that their casual cruelty was just family dynamics. I could be myself again, whoever that turned out to be. After years of trying to fit into their impossible expectations, as I finished my bourbon and prepared for the first peaceful night's sleep I'd had in years, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. They tried to give me the gift of humiliation, but instead they'd given me something far more valuable. The motivation to finally cut myself free from their web of manipulation and control. Freedom, it turned out, was the best Christmas present I'd ever received.